against ground targets. Later, the B-24s from the 380th would strike at another key oil installation, Balikpapan. Sometimes called the Ploesti of the East, the refineries around Balikpapan supplied Japan with most of its oil and aviation gas. Initially, the 380th Bomb Group went after Balikpapan by itself in daylight and at night. Unescorted, its B-24s suffered heavy losses.
In 1944, General Kenny, the commander of Far East Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, felt that if his heavy bombers could knock out Balikpapan, Borneo, and the oil fields and the refineries around that city, that they could force the Japanese to surrender. Balikpapan was seen sort of as the Ploesti of the East, as the big holy grail target for the Southwest Pacific Air Forces. And that was really wishful thinking. The Japanese weren't going to surrender because they didn't have an oil refinery in Borneo. With the arrival of the 13th Air Force and their B-24s, he actually had enough bomb groups to actually make a sustained heavy series of strikes on Balikpapan, and he took advantage of that opportunity. And he personally visited the bomb groups to try to buck up morale and get those guys behind this operation.
In the early days of October, the bombers flew the 1,200 miles to the target and back alone. In the process, Japanese interceptors knocked down many of the raiders. Kenny's B-24 groups couldn't withstand such losses. Short on crews and with few replacements in sight, he had to figure out a way to protect his B-24s, or he wouldn't have enough bombers to cover the coming invasion of the Philippines. Fortunately, his 5th Air Force fighter groups found a way to get their P-47s and P-38s from Morotai to Balikpapan and back. Starting October 11, 1944, the bombers went to the refineries covered by swarms of little friends. The Japanese rose to greet the attackers and were massacred by the P-38s and 47s. Balikpapan was hit hard, though the refineries were not totally knocked out. The Balikpapan raids were the longest missions of the war in the Pacific for the fighters that accompanied the B-24s. Some of the fighter pilots were airborne for over 8 hours and landed with just a few drops of fuel remaining in their tanks.
The problem was the target was not really worthwhile. The Japanese didn't have the shipping left to haul all the oil up to Japan, so whether or not their production facility there was destroyed was really immaterial. The reality was they couldn't get the oil that was even being produced at that point to Japan. There just weren't the tankers left because the American submarine campaign had just ravaged Japan's sea lanes.
While Kenny's B-24s were pounding Balikpapan, over in England, the Liberators of the 3rd Air Division, 8th Air Force, were being used to hit targets deep in Germany. Early on, operational experience showed that B-17s and 24s could not really operate together as they had very different cruise speeds. As a result, the 8th's B-24s were separated into their own air division and were frequently used on feints and diversionary attacks. This secondary role grated on the Liberator crews, who knew their aircraft could strike targets anywhere in Europe. Finally, the 8th began sending the 3rd Air Division on more meaningful missions, always covered by hundreds of escort fighters. The B-24s were still more vulnerable than the B-17 and needed as much protection as possible. 8th Air Force Liberators spent 1944 and 45 hitting cities and factories deep in Germany, Poland, and Austria. At times, only the 8th's P-51 Mustangs had the range to follow the B-24s to their distant targets and back. Across Europe, losses continued to be heavy. German fighters were becoming less of a threat, but large concentrations of flak guns began to take their toll.
The plane had been on our right as they went over the target, they got a direct hit right in the waist. And when the flak exploded, or whatever it was, well, it had been flak, exploded inside the plane, and it just looked like a little ruffle, like kind of bulged out, you know, all the way around the plane. And at that mission, I was a fly in the waist, and he was just right there, you know, where I could look right out there and see him. And pretty soon, where that expanded out, the plane broke in two, and the engine just tilted up and went straight into the ground, and the tailpiece went up over the plane behind them, and then ducked down and went down underneath the plane, the next plane. It just flipped. Lucky, not for them, but for the guy behind, and the two planes behind him. They were real fortunate.
Not only did the air crews have to worry about flak and fighters, but they also needed to be aware of more insidious, less common ploys the Germans used to try to bring down the Allied bombers.
One time that there was a B-24 come in and tried to join up with us, tried to get into our formation, you know. They had that top turret just going round and around there, trying to persuade us that they could come in, you know, and join up with us. But we wouldn't let them, because we didn't know. Because they had captured some of the planes and were flying them themselves. And so the engineer then put off a flare, and they couldn't answer the code with the flares, and so they backed off, and that was the last I seen of them. That was quite prevalent, you know. They had warned us about this, that don't let a plane in, that unless you're absolutely sure, and that was why the flares were supposed to acknowledge, you know, that was one of our group.
If a captured plane were able to get into a tight formation of B-24s, it would have the potential to do substantial damage. In Italy, the 15th Air Force, by 1944, had been fighting a war of its own against the soft underbelly of the Third Reich. The 15th's B-24s routinely hit targets in northern Italy, Austria, Eastern Europe, and of course, Ploesti. In 1944, however, with the arrival of the P-51D, these Mediterranean-based liberators were able to strike Berlin from the south and have a protective fighter escort through the entire mission. The Berlin raids were fiercely contested affairs, and the 15th's B-24 crews were hit by everything the Luftwaffe had left, including the Me-262 jet fighter. Again, losses were heavy, but the 15th kept up the pressure, providing, along with the 8th Air Force, a constant 1-2 punch against the Reich. In the spring of 1945, the B-24 groups in Europe took part in several highly unusual missions. During the Allied effort to cross the Rhine, the largest airborne assault of World War II was made by American and British paratroop and glider units. Fighting alone and isolated on the eastern side of the Rhine,